Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night.
I've spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the backcountry of northern Ontario, and I thought I had learned every rhythm the forest could offer. Snow felt comfortable to me. That winter, though, the woods refused familiarity. It started the moment I left the service road for the old survey trail, a path so overgrown that my snowmobile nearly refused to pass. The air was colder than it should have been, not just physically, but in some way that pressed against thought itself. My boots sank into fresh snow, leaving impressions I could follow for hours, yet every turn and dip of the trail seemed subtly altered. Trees leaned differently, rocks rose where there had been none. Even the creek I passed had shifted a few meters to the east. I chalked it up to memory. You remember things wrong when alone long enough. I tried to ignore it. That was my first mistake. The survey cabin I was heading toward hadn't checked in for 3 weeks. 3 weeks isn't unusual during winter storms, but protocol required a check. I left a note on the station board and pushed deeper into the forest than I had in years. By mid-afternoon, the snowmobile stalled, the battery too weak for the cold, and I continued on foot. The silence thickened immediately. No wind, no birds, not even the subtle scrape of branches against snow. It wasn't the natural quiet I knew. This felt measured, as though the forest had stopped breathing to watch me. My steps sounded loud, even to me, though snow usually dampens sound. Something, somewhere, was listening. That's when I saw the first tracks. Human. Boot prints, freshly pressed in snow, but too long and even to belong to anyone walking naturally in deep snow. I knelt to inspect the snow, brushing away flakes. There was no sign of struggle or flight. It was as if someone had stepped off the earth entirely. My heart rate climbed despite my calm training. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps another ranger, lost and cautious, doubling back. Maybe even hunters. It didn't make sense, and that fact made my stomach tighten. The cabin itself appeared in a clearing just as daylight began to falter. Its door was open, hinges frozen in place. Snow hadn't drifted inside. The fire pit was cold, yet not abandoned. The logs had been stacked neatly, untouched. What unsettled me most were the grooves carved into the doorframe. 5 parallel marks, deep and narrow, placed at shoulder height. Too precise for tools, too deliberate to be animal scratches. I remember staring at them, thinking with a clarity that was almost painful. Whoever made these knew exactly where a person's face would be when entering. And yet the cabin seemed untouched in every other way, as if a presence had merely tested the space without occupying it. I didn't step inside right away. Instinct told me to circle first. 17 years of patrolling taught me patience, especially when something felt off. I scanned the tree line, rifle low, every sense alert. The snow around the cabin was untouched, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Yet the door stood open, angled almost invitingly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me long before I noticed the tracks. I crouched to examine the grooves on the doorframe again. They were not random, not careless. Deep, vertical cuts ending abruptly, like someone had paused mid-motion, leaving the trace of an intent unfinished. Inside, the cabin smelled empty. Not decay, not rot, just hollow. A table swept clean, a bunk neatly made, supplies untouched. The radio hung on its hook, battery warm to the touch. That shouldn't have been possible. I tried calling the station, Only static replied. I checked the logbook. The last entry was 21 days old. Survey complete. Wildlife minimal. Area quiet. No notes afterward. Then I heard it. A sound outside, slow and deliberate. Not a footstep. More like pressure shifting, snow compressing under some unseen weight. I froze. The forest was completely silent otherwise. No wind, no branches, no birds. I moved to the window and brushed frost aside. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed the trees. Too close. Pines don't migrate, don't bend in unison, but it felt like the forest had leaned toward me, gathering itself while I wasn't looking. The sound came again, closer, right against the cabin wall. I raised my rifle, finger off the trigger. "Ranger," I called, "identify yourself." My voice sounded hollow, foreign. No answer. Instead, something brushed the exterior wall, a slow, gentle drag, not heavy, testing, not striking. I backed away, waiting, listening, and then it stopped. Silence returned so abruptly my ears rang. I waited a full minute. Nothing moved. I stepped outside cautiously. No tracks, no disturbances, nothing. The forest was normal again. I told myself I imagined it. Stress, isolation, cold. I packed to leave before nightfall. That's when I saw my own footprints, leading away from the cabin, fresh, deep in the snow. But I had not walked that path. The stride, the depth, the direction, all wrong. My chest tightened as a certainty settled cold in my gut. I hadn't left yet. Somehow, and someone or something had walked in my place.
I didn't follow the footprints immediately. My instincts screamed caution. Instead, I retraced my steps to the cabin, examining everything again. The grooves in the doorframe seemed sharper now, as if they deepened overnight. The radio, once silent, now emitted faint vibrations, almost like a hum beneath perception. I wrapped it in my jacket and laid it under the bunk. The forest outside remained unnervingly still, as if it too were observing. I took the trail back toward the snowmobile, but the path had changed. Rocks, trees, and small ridges were subtly displaced. The creek appeared miles from its known crossing point. I checked my GPS, signal strong, map frozen in place. It refused to align with what my eyes saw. Every turn I made seemed to lead me slightly off the path I'd known. Panic nudged at the edge of my mind. I reminded myself, always rationalize first. Humans forget. Humans misremember. The forest does not. Then I heard a voice, my own, whispering from somewhere just beyond the tree line. "Keep moving," it said, soft, calm. It wasn't threatening, but the familiarity of it chilled me. I called out. No reply. The snow muffled everything, yet I could feel the words vibrating around me. I walked on, scanning, breathing shallow. The voice fell silent as abruptly as it began, replaced by the old, unnatural quiet. By the time I found the snowmobile, darkness was thickening. Relief hit me. I started the engine. The seat was warm, not snow-covered. I hadn't expected it. My tracks circled the machine in perfect loops, back and forth. I had no memory of pacing there. I mounted anyway, accelerating along the faint trail. From the corner of my eye, movement slipped between trunks. Not a shape, not clearly a figure, just a motion where there shouldn't have been one. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Something was testing me. learning me. Night fell faster than natural. The sky dimmed like someone had flipped a switch. I followed the snowmobile cautiously. Every landmark seemed displaced, repeated. The same bent spruce appeared 3 times within minutes. I shut off the engine and killed the headlamp. Darkness swallowed everything. Then the forest exhaled. Not wind, not sound, a low collective vibration through snow, roots, and ground. I felt it in my teeth, in the soles of my boots. Footsteps began, all around me, perfectly paced, matching mine. I froze. They stopped when I did. I moved. They moved. From the shadows, a shape resolved, tall, indistinct, no eyes, no face, yet it studied me the same way I studied prints in snow. It raised an arm, mirrored mine perfectly. My rifle, my grip, my old injury tremor. Understanding hit. It wasn't mocking me, it was learning. I stumbled on a root. It did not stumble. It adapted. When I finally turned the headlamp back on, the forest was empty again. Only trees, snow, and silence. I rode until the engine sputtered. By dawn, I reached the service road. According to my watch, I'd been gone 20 hours. According to my body, far longer. A report was filed. Nothing mentioned the voice, the shape, the footsteps. They wouldn't believe it. I told myself, stress, cold, hypothermia. That explanation held exactly until another ranger disappeared nearby. They asked me to return after the disappearance. Experience, familiarity. The unspoken assumption was that if anyone could understand this place, it would be me. I said yes before thinking, before questioning. That night, alone in my bunk, I dreamed of walking trails I'd never known, yet each step felt remembered, instinctive. I awoke with the taste of pine resin on my tongue and wet snow in my boots, though I hadn't left the cabin. Something was here with me already. The second trip was immediately different. The forest seemed to anticipate my every move. The snow shifted underfoot as if guiding me. Twigs and branches didn't snap under my weight. I realized I could hear footsteps that weren't mine, faint at first, then growing distinct. Steps that mimicked mine, perfectly paced. I stopped. They stopped. I moved again. They moved. My heartbeat synchronized with something beyond comprehension. At the old survey cabin, the door was closed. Grooves in the wood appeared deeper, fresh. Inside, the logbook lay open to a page dated tomorrow, my handwriting scrawled across it. I didn't read it. I knew. Outside, snow began to fall in thick sheets, erasing any evidence of my presence. I understood then. The forest doesn't trap people. It replaces them. It learns your pattern, your habits, your mind, until it no longer needs the original. That night I patrolled alone, my rifle ready. The silence was immense. Every snap of a branch sounded like a warning. Footsteps echoed in rhythm with mine. I had to remind myself to breathe slowly. The forest seemed almost sentient, pressing against thought itself. When I closed my eyes, I imagined another pair of boots following me, not behind, not in front, beside me, matching my stride, perfectly synchronized. By morning, I realized I'd been walking in a loop for hours, though it felt like minutes. I returned to the snowmobile. Tracks surrounded it, not my own. They circled, doubled back, but never left. The engine sputtered to life. The forest exhaled as if satisfied. I drove until daylight broke the tree line, finally reaching the service road. The missing ranger's disappearance was quietly noted, another unexplained loss.
The sector was closed. I stayed on desk duty after that. Nights were restless. I could feel the forest even through walls and windows. Footsteps echoed down hallways, soft and precise, matching my pace. Sometimes I woke to see shadows linger just beyond the lamp's glow, indistinct yet deliberate. The boundaries of reality and memory began to blur. My own reflection in glass didn't always match my movements immediately. There were delays, subtle and frightening. Then came the emails. No sender, only coordinates in the closure area. I deleted them. Maps appeared on my desk, folded the way I fold mine, creased in familiar corners. Circles in red pencil marked locations I knew too well. It was inviting me back. I told myself I wouldn't go, yet a week later I found myself driving north. I didn't remember turning off the highway. When I noticed, the forest was waiting, silent and precise. Snow blanketed everything. Trails opened where none should exist. I followed a familiar rhythm, instinct over reason. Hours passed. I arrived at a lake I barely remembered, dark water beneath melting ice. A figure stood on the far shore, my height, my build, my jacket, head tilted, watching the trees, not moving toward me, not away, just studying. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. After a long pause, it stepped into the tree line and vanished. The forest closed behind it. I stayed until dusk. My footprints were joined by another set. Only one set led back to the road.
Time stretched differently in the north. Days felt like weeks. Trails repeated themselves, then diverged unexpectedly. I began noticing the new arrivals, hunters, hikers, surveyors, wandering into areas they shouldn't, drawn by invisible threads. I guided each carefully, silently. One asked me directly what I was. I showed him his own footprints diverging from themselves. He heard his voice calling from nowhere. Understanding replaced fear. He accepted it. The forest exhaled with satisfaction. The burned cabin from my first winter patrol had been rebuilt. In dreams, I saw it perfectly restored, my hand writing in a logbook I couldn't read. Ash dusted my desk. I hadn't been there, yet I knew instinctively that it had waited for me. My steps in the snow now echoed with my past self, guiding the forest's pattern. I was no longer merely an observer. I was a conductor.
Winter returned with its weight. Snow blanketed the forest in precision, smoothing trails, preserving patterns. I patrolled with new arrivals nearby, letting them believe they led themselves. The forest whispered their names softly, guiding them toward understanding. One lingered too long at a wrong turn. I showed him patience, not force. By dawn, he followed without thought. His steps matched the rhythm of the woods. Balance was restored. I stopped counting how many came through. It doesn't matter. Only rhythm, only pattern. Occasionally, I find remnants of old life, a boot print, a discarded tape, a cabin scarred by memory. They serve as reminders of cycles, of learning. The forest hums approval at night, quiet and subtle. If you ever reach this edge, listen. Do not step in blindly. The forest observes, it learns, it waits, and it knows your name before you do.
The forest's rhythm followed me even off the trail. At night, in the cabin I'd claimed as temporary base, I could feel the snow outside shift subtly as I moved within. Footsteps echoed too closely for comfort, but never in the right place. I raised my rifle more often than was prudent, scanning, always scanning. Then came the voice, not loud, not yelling, just my name, whispered softly,
calm. It was my voice, or nearly so. Enough difference to unsettle me, enough similarity to make my chest tighten. I called out. Silence. The radio hummed faintly, though batteries were dead. I wrapped it in cloth and shoved it under the bunk. The hum persisted, faint and vibrating against my ribs. I left the cabin before sunrise, taking the trail again, or so I thought. Every tree leaned slightly differently. Every stone was displaced. Hours passed, but the markers I'd left behind were already gone, replaced by others in the exact height and spacing I would have chosen. I told myself I was imagining things, rationalized it, but my instinct screamed otherwise. Snowdrifts formed walls and corridors I hadn't noticed before. The forest was sculpting itself around me. I moved cautiously, rifle raised, senses alert. Then I saw footprints in fresh snow. Not mine, not another human's. Something long, narrow, perfectly proportioned to me. They stopped mid-trail. Nothing else. I followed cautiously. There was no continuation, no trace, just the impression left as if someone or something stepped off the earth itself. I stopped, waited. Nothing happened. The forest exhaled. By mid-afternoon, I reached the burned cabin from years ago. It stood rebuilt, perfect. No evidence of fire, no soot, no ash. Wood polished, logs stacked neatly, as though untouched by time. I didn't step inside. I couldn't. Something about it resonated with memory I didn't know I'd retained. I circled it, scanning. The grooves on the doorframe were deeper, sharper, precisely at eye level. I thought of the missing ranger. Or maybe he wasn't missing. Maybe the forest simply tested the patience of its newest pattern. I continued north along a creek, frozen but moving under ice. Footprints matched mine exactly. I had not walked there. Panic flared. I tried to retrace my route. Impossible. Landmarks repeated, shifted, doubled back. Hours blurred. I understood then that the forest did not trap you. It taught you, replicated your rhythm, tested your comprehension. Every decision mattered. The first new arrival appeared at dusk, a hiker, alone, confused. She followed instinct, not logic. I allowed it. That's the way it worked. You guided. You let the forest teach. She approached too closely to an unseen bend. I intervened, softly, silently. She nodded. Trust established, without questions asked. Observation, not instruction, was the method. By night, the snow thickened, muffling everything except the subtle creaks of frozen branches. My own footprints were joined by another set, perfectly aligned, synchronized. I stopped. The footsteps halted. I moved. They moved. I realized then the forest had someone with me, learning from my patterns, testing responses, preparing for its next step. I reached a clearing. Moonlight on ice created illusions of movement. I saw it, a figure, tall, indistinct, shadowed. It mirrored my posture, my pauses, even the small gestures I made without thinking. Not menacing, curious, observing, waiting. I could feel it cataloging, memorizing, refining, a part of me, and yet not. I left the clearing carefully, retracing steps I didn't recognize having taken. Hours later, back at the service road, I realized my GPS had no record of the night's travel. Time itself had shifted. Days and nights folded into each other. Back in the cabin, the radio hummed again, faint, even with no batteries. The logbook sat open, pages filled with entries in handwriting that matched mine,
but spoke of events I hadn't experienced yet. The forest had begun shaping not just space, but perception. It tested boundaries, memory, and identity. I left notes for headquarters, minimal, factual, no mention of voices, footsteps, or shadowed figures. They would not understand. They could not. The sector remained closed. Occasionally, I hear about new disappearances, patrols that never check in. The forest does not seek attention. It shapes, adjusts, perfects. I patrol now with an awareness I cannot shake. Every step is measured, every action observed. Sometimes I hear my name whispered from just beyond the trees. I do not answer. I know it is already familiar with me, and I know its patience. If you ever hear your own name calmly spoken in the silence of snow, stop, step back. The forest has already started learning. Spring thaw arrived unevenly. Snow receded in strange patterns, revealing trails that should not have existed. I noticed footprints leading nowhere and back again. Someone, or something, had walked them hours before I arrived, yet no one had been there. I began to realize the forest didn't just observe, it anticipated. Every move I made, every path I chose, it remembered, corrected, reshaped. I felt watched, always, even when alone. I encountered the first new ranger of the season at a small ridge, experienced, careful, but naive in ways I no longer was. His footsteps were hesitant. I stayed just out of sight, letting him progress along the trail, allowing him to trust instinct over logic. The forest guided him as it had guided me. Subtle signs, shifting branches, patterns in snow. I remained invisible, a silent observer, knowing he would follow correctly if he listened carefully. At dusk, he stumbled near a small creek where ice formed unnatural angles. I could hear the panic in his breath. He had seen the same shadows I had, just out of focus. I stepped forward, voice calm, indistinct. He flinched, but did not flee. By the time I guided him through the bend, he was already aligned with the forest's rhythm. Footsteps, pace, gaze, all synchronized. Balance restored. That night, I slept lightly. Footsteps outside the cabin mirrored my own, as they always did. My reflection in the window lagged behind my movements, subtle and disorienting. Dreams returned, trails I hadn't walked, figures I hadn't met, repeating loops that resolved in ways my mind couldn't comprehend. I awoke, boots wet with snow, chest tight. Something had moved while I slept. Something had observed. I did not check. Morning revealed tracks that should have been impossible. They led from the cabin to the tree line, then vanished mid-snowbank. I followed cautiously, every muscle tense. The forest shifted subtly, trees leaning slightly, as if guiding me along an unseen path. A creek I didn't recall appeared suddenly, its water unnaturally clear, ice melting without sunlight. My instruments failed, compass spun, GPS froze, nothing measured reality correctly. I understood then, the forest wasn't just alive, it learned, adapted, and perfected itself. And it had begun to teach me, whether I wanted the lesson or not. By mid-week, new arrivals appeared with disturbing regularity. Hunters, hikers, surveyors. I observed them, guiding silently, subtly, allowing the forest to calibrate each one. Some resisted. One former military ranger noticed discrepancies too quickly, questioned coincidences, marked trails meticulously.
I allowed him freedom until the moment the forest tested him. I showed him his own footprints diverging mid-path, a whisper of his own voice echoing from behind trees. Understanding replaced panic. The burned cabin resurfaced in dreams again, logs perfectly stacked, fire pit neat, walls polished. Ash dusted my desk in the cabin, though I hadn't entered. My movements in the snow mirrored my past selves, teaching the forest my rhythm. I realized then I was more than observer. I was conductor, buffer, keeper, teacher. My identity began to stretch, expanding beyond myself, folding into the forest's memory.
Winter returned in fragments. Snow fell unpredictably, smoothing trails, erasing markers, hiding discrepancies. I patrolled with the new arrivals, close enough to observe, far enough to maintain their learning curve. The forest whispered names softly, guiding steps, adjusting balance. I intervened only when necessary, voice calm, almost imperceptible. One misstep threatened misalignment. I guided him without force. By dawn, the forest accepted the rhythm again. I began to notice irregularities beyond human perception, spaces where sound bent around roots, shadows that mirrored me with minor differences, reflections in ice that lagged or accelerated. The forest's sentience was undeniable. It was patient, and it had begun cataloging me, shaping me into a pattern, just as I had guided others. I felt the first stirrings of inevitability. I would remain here until replaced, and someday I would become indistinguishable from the forest itself. By mid-spring, the forest's influence had grown unmistakable. Trails I thought I knew twisted in impossible ways. Trees leaned to guide my steps. Rocks shifted subtly overnight. The soundscape was altered, too. Branches creaked with a rhythm matching my heartbeat, snow compressed under unseen weight. I realized I no longer simply walked these woods. I moved in concert with it. My perception had become a tool the forest calibrated. One evening, I encountered a lone hiker, lost and exhausted. She followed instinct, not logic, as newcomers always did. I allowed her freedom, watching her mirror my movements unknowingly. Snow crunched beneath her steps in perfect cadence with mine. When she reached a clearing, the faintest whispers echoed her own name. She paused, eyes wide, trembling slightly. I said nothing. Sometimes guidance meant watching and doing nothing. Later, I returned to the burned cabin from years ago. It stood rebuilt, perfect as always. Logs stacked, walls polished, fire pit neat. Yet I did not enter. The forest had claimed the space. It existed for observation, not habitation. I stood outside, noting the grooves in the doorframe, deep, precise, deliberate. They always changed subtly, reflecting some need of the forest. I understood then that every mark, every indentation was part of its teaching. I was part of it too. Nights grew long. The forest hummed around me faintly, imperceptibly, vibrating through roots and snow. Footsteps accompanied mine constantly, not human, not entirely mine. Shadowed shapes mirrored my posture, gestures, even hesitations. At times, reflections in ice lagged or anticipated my movements. I began to understand that this place was learning me, cataloging my habits, my instincts, my fears. I dreamed again of impossible paths, loops that led nowhere, trails folding over themselves, cabins rebuilt with meticulous perfection. I woke with snow dusting my boots, chest tight,
limbs aching despite sleep. Something moved while I rested. I could feel the presence pressing against perception itself. Every decision became heavy. Even the slightest hesitation rippled through the forest. By day, I guided new arrivals with subtlety. Hunters, surveyors, hikers, they followed instinct, trusting patterns they did not understand. Some asked questions. I replied only when necessary. Their footsteps synchronized with mine. Their decisions mirrored what the forest required. Misalignment was corrected not with force, but with patience. Observation alone sufficed.
I noticed a hollow in the forest one morning, a space that was not quite natural. The snow did not fall there. Sound bent around it. It was absence given shape, yet it felt deliberate. I approached cautiously, rifle raised, heart steady. The forest did not guide me this time. It waited, allowing me to observe. I understood that some things in these woods moved only when acknowledged. Some presences waited, patient and unhurried. I retreated slowly. The hollow remained. Its boundaries shifted subtly, adjusting to my gaze, to my awareness. The forest thickened trails elsewhere, redirecting movement. Containment through neglect. I reported nothing. There is no protocol for absence shaped like intent. That evening, I heard voices. My own? Not quite. Slightly altered, almost imperceptible. The words were familiar, but rearranged. The forest had begun shaping perception, memory, even identity. I did not respond. To respond would have been to disturb the lesson. Winter returned. Snow reshaped the trails, erased marks, concealed evidence. I patrolled alongside a group of new arrivals, letting them believe they led themselves. The forest whispered softly, correcting each misstep, adjusting pace and posture. One lingered too long near a misleading ridge. I guided him silently. By dawn, he moved in perfect alignment, rhythm restored. I began to notice irregularities beyond human perception, spaces where sound bent unnaturally, shadows that mirrored my actions with subtle differences, reflections in ice that lagged or accelerated. The forest's sentience was undeniable. It was patient. It catalogued everything. And I, slowly, was becoming one with it. My identity stretched. My perception folded into the pattern. I understood. I would remain here until replaced, and someday, my own steps would guide another. The snow came heavier now, blanketing everything and erasing the trails I had memorized. I moved cautiously, boots crunching in rhythm with the forest's subtle hum. Footsteps that weren't mine mirrored my own perfectly, keeping pace beside and behind me. Shadows twisted in corners of vision, indistinct yet deliberate. I had begun to notice that my reflection in ice and windows lagged slightly, sometimes moving before I did, sometimes after. I knew then that the forest was no longer just observing, it was testing, shaping, learning. I guided new arrivals silently, letting them mirror the rhythm I had ingrained into myself. Their hesitation was corrected without my touch, by subtle shifts in trees and snow, the forest itself instructing. One misstep and I felt a low vibration, like a warning beneath my feet. I reminded myself that patience mattered, that alignment was everything. I had become more than ranger. I was conduit, buffer, teacher, part of the pattern that kept the forest balanced, aware that one wrong motion could ripple outward unpredictably. By night, the wind ceased entirely. Not still air, but absence of sound, presence of pressure. I stopped moving and felt the forest exhale. The unseen footsteps mirrored mine perfectly.
I could sense something shifting beside me, something tall, indistinct, moving in rhythm but never visible. My breath came shallow and precise, calculated to match the invisible pulse around me. Dreams returned, trails folding over themselves, footprints splitting in impossible ways, cabins rebuilt overnight, objects appearing where none had been. I awoke to snow crusted inside my boots, my heart hammering in alignment with the unseen rhythm. I understood then that I was already part of the lesson, my movements catalogued, my pattern being integrated into something larger than myself. I guided new arrivals that night, not speaking, not touching, allowing them to adjust, to learn, to synchronize. By dawn, their steps matched the forest's invisible cadence, and I felt the slow certainty of inevitability creep into me. I would not leave until another took my place, just as I had learned from those before.
The hollow returned, the space of absence shaped like intent. Snow did not fall there, sound bent around it. I approached and felt a tug at memory and perception, as though my mind were being catalogued and reshaped. I did not speak. I did not move hastily. The forest waited, patient and deliberate. The hollow pulsed with subtle awareness, mirroring me, yet not me. I stepped back and felt the surrounding trails thicken, the forest redirecting, balancing, teaching. Every new arrival was guided through these unseen lessons, their rhythm adjusted with care. The echoes of my own voice reached from the shadows, altered slightly, teaching me to measure even thought, even hesitation. I realized fully that I had become part of the system, a node in a living, sentient network, where memory, motion, and perception blended seamlessly. There was no distinction anymore between myself and the lessons I imparted. Winter folded fully over the land. Trails vanished beneath fresh snow. The forest hummed softly beneath my boots, a steady rhythm that matched my pulse. Footsteps mirrored mine constantly, beside, behind, sometimes ahead, always in perfect alignment. Shadows twisted, reflections in ice lagged or anticipated movement, subtle alterations of perception I could no longer distinguish from reality. I guided newcomers silently, letting the forest correct every misalignment, teaching without instruction, balancing without interference. I understood at last that this place did not take people. People arrived incomplete. The forest finished the work, shaping, teaching, perfecting. I walked, steps precise, heart synchronized, knowing that someday another would follow me, mirror my actions, and become part of the pattern, and that I too had become part of something larger, a rhythm eternal, subtle, and inexorably complete. I had been a park ranger for 6 years, patrolling forests, mountains, and lakes across the northern states, but nothing prepared me for Alaska. When I stepped off the small bush plane onto the snow-crusted airstrip, the cold hit me like a living thing, biting through my parka and gloves, freezing every exposed inch of skin. The landscape stretched endlessly, dense conifers weighed down with snow, jagged mountain ridges that disappeared into low clouds, and the kind of silence that presses against the mind. My assignment was simple on paper, a 6-week solo winter patrol in a remote section near the Denali foothills, checking for wildlife, ensuring trail markers were intact, and reporting any unusual activity. Reality was different. I lugged my pack through the knee-deep snow, following the only cleared path to the ranger station, where I would spend the first night. The building itself looked small against the immensity of the wilderness. Log walls dusted in frost, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney.
Inside, the wood stove was already lit, throwing warmth that smelled faintly of pine and soot. I set down my pack and ran a quick inventory of my supplies, noting the extra food rations, sleeping bag rated for -40, and the emergency flare kit. Alone, here, every mistake could be fatal. That night, I lay in my bunk, listening. The wind rasped through the trees outside, but beneath it, I could swear there were other sounds. Faint snapping of branches, almost imperceptible footfalls on the snow outside. I told myself it was the forest settling, the wind shifting limbs, my imagination heightened by isolation. Morning came gray and heavy. I stepped outside, boots sinking into fresh powder, and began my patrol along the trail markers that stretched toward the mountains. Everything seemed normal at first. Tracks of snowshoe hares crisscrossed my path, a lynx paw print appeared near a creek. But then I saw them. Large footprints, human-like but elongated, far too long to be anyone my size. They disappeared abruptly at the edge of a grove, no sign of continuation. I knelt to inspect them. They were fresh. The snow hadn't drifted over them, and the impressions were deep, deliberate. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was just another ranger on a break, or perhaps a hunter passing through illegally. I left a note at the trailhead and continued deeper into the forest. Hours passed, the air thickening with a silence unlike any I'd known. No birds, no distant coyote cries, no wind moving through the pines. Even my own footsteps sounded loud, echoing unnaturally. I reached a small clearing where I had seen an old survey cabin marked on the map. The building was partially collapsed, snow covering half the roof, the door hanging open. Inside, the wood stove was cold but neat, and on the table was a faint indentation of a cup in the frost-dusted wood. Nothing else, yet the sense of being watched pressed against me. Something had been here, but it was gone now, deliberate and careful. I stepped back, scanning the tree line, noticing movement that wasn't there, shadows that didn't belong. I shook it off and set up my perimeter, checking gear and noting every sound, every subtle shift in the forest. By nightfall, I was certain of one thing. This place was vast, patient, and far older than my experience could measure. Something waited here, and it knew I had arrived.
The next morning, I followed the trail deeper into the forest, my senses sharper than ever, every snap of a twig underfoot echoing like a gunshot. Snow clung to branches, dripping silently as I passed, and I noticed the wind had a peculiar rhythm, a pulse that seemed almost deliberate. Tracks appeared alongside the trail again, too large to belong to me, too deliberate to be random. They curved around tree trunks, paused at rock edges, and sometimes disappeared into thin air. I began keeping my rifle ready at all times, checking corners of the trees where shadows lingered just a beat too long. Midday came with a pale sun filtering through clouds, and I paused at a small frozen creek to drink and eat a protein bar. Something shifted in the tree line, just a movement at the edge of perception. I froze, heartbeat loud in my ears. There was no wind, no animals, yet I could feel it watching, waiting. I followed the trail along the creek for another mile and spotted the remnants of a campsite long abandoned, tent poles broken, food scattered and frozen in snow. The ground around it had deep, irregular footprints, larger than any human, claw-like imprints faintly visible in the snow. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I felt a chill that wasn't from the air. I told myself it was a wild animal, maybe a moose or bear, but the prints didn't match anything I'd seen before. I decided to mark the location in my GPS and keep moving, rationalizing fear into professional caution. By afternoon, I reached a small ridge overlooking the valley below.
The view was breathtaking, mountains stretching endlessly, white peaks cutting into clouds, rivers glinting through the forest. But the beauty was laced with unease. Across the valley, among the distant trees, I thought I saw something standing upright, too still to be an animal and far too large to be a human. A tall figure, partially obscured by snow and mist. It didn't move, yet I could feel it aligning with my movements, the way the forest seemed to breathe around it. I stared for several long seconds before it vanished, not running, not hiding, simply gone. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself exhaustion was playing tricks. I pressed on, following the trail back toward a smaller cabin I had noted for emergencies. The forest grew denser, branches scraping against my shoulders, snow crunching underfoot in inconsistent rhythms, as if the earth itself were uneven. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk was falling, turning the sky to steel gray. I set up a small fire outside and scanned the tree line. No footprints, no movement, yet the feeling persisted, a weight pressing against thought, against reason. I could not shake the notion that I was not alone.
Night came with wind, howling low through the pines, carrying faint, unintelligible whispers. I kept the fire burning, rifle across my lap, scanning the tree line where moonlight carved long shadows. Every snap of a branch or thump of falling snow made me jump. Every shadow stretched and shifted in impossible ways. I realized I hadn't heard any animal sounds since morning. Not a bird, not a fox, not a rustle in the underbrush. Only silence, thick and deliberate. Around midnight I heard it, a branch snapping near the tree line, far enough to be out of range for any human, but close enough to make my pulse spike. I whispered my own name, half expecting an echo, half expecting nothing. The forest answered not with sound, but with a sensation, a subtle pressure, as if something was studying me, pacing my heartbeat. Sleep became impossible. I stayed awake, listening to the wind, every sense sharpened, mind straining to parse the ordinary from the unnatural. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes moving in the snow just beyond firelight, too slow to be an animal, too deliberate to be imagination. I traced their positions in my mind, noting each pause, each alignment, like the forest itself was teaching me to observe. Dawn came gray and heavy. I was exhausted, but I packed quickly and followed the trail again, feeling eyes on me the entire way. The valley below stretched endlessly, and I noticed more footprints alongside mine, larger, irregular, and too precise to be random. They sometimes mirrored my path perfectly, sometimes led into the trees and vanished. I considered turning back, but my instincts told me the trail held answers. I pressed on toward a river crossing marked on my map, the snow crunching louder in the silence. Somewhere upstream, I saw movement too swift for a human, a shadow that shifted and disappeared almost instantly. My heartbeat spiked, yet I pressed forward. The trail led me along the frozen edge, ice cracking faintly beneath my boots. The forest seemed alive, bending subtly around me, guiding me, watching me, and I felt the first real fear. This was no ordinary wilderness. Something waited, patient, intelligent, and it knew I had arrived. Midday brought a frozen creek splitting the trail. I carefully crossed, testing each ice patch with my boot, when I noticed something in the snow ahead, a set of prints, impossibly long, narrow, clawed at the toes, and arranged with deliberate spacing. They led alongside mine, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always precise, never erratic. I knelt to examine them, tracing one with my gloved hand. The impression was deep, sharp, and cold, as though the creature weighed more than any human, but moved with uncanny control. I looked around, no sign of the source. Then I heard it,
a low exhalation through snow and trees, deliberate, almost mimicking breath. My pulse spiked. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. I raised my rifle, scanning slowly, methodically, the cold air stinging my lungs. I took a step forward. Something mirrored me, perfectly in sync in the periphery of vision. I froze. The forest exhaled with me. The trail continued into denser woods, darker snow, shadows stretching impossibly between trees. My instinct screamed to retreat, but curiosity, duty, and that unnameable lure kept me moving. Hours passed in a blur of white and shadow. The creature never appeared fully, never made a direct move, only its presence, the pressure, the alignment, the shadows that moved with intention. By late afternoon, I arrived at a small clearing marked on my map as a campsite for emergency use. Snow-covered logs formed a circle, and I noted a faint footprint on the edge, elongated and jagged at the heel. No human had passed this way. No animal could make such marks. I felt a shiver that wasn't from cold. The forest was teaching me, testing me, and I was beginning to understand that whatever waited here, it was patient, intelligent, and far older than I was.
I stayed in the small emergency clearing longer than intended, checking supplies and scanning the tree line constantly. The snow drifted subtly, reshaping the ground around the campsite, erasing minor impressions almost immediately. I noticed one of the elongated footprints had returned near my fire pit, slightly closer than before. My pulse accelerated, but I reminded myself to stay calm, rationalize fear into focus. I set out again along the trail marked on my GPS, which had begun acting strangely. Waypoints blinked in and out of existence, and the map seemed distorted, twisting hills and valleys in ways I didn't recognize. The forest had shifted overnight. I noticed the trees leaning subtly, almost like guides, nudging me along a path I hadn't chosen consciously. Shadows danced in the peripheral vision, lingering slightly longer than they should, sometimes splitting my own. A crack echoed behind me, a branch snapping, but no wind, no animal. I froze, rifle up, scanning slowly. Nothing appeared, yet I could feel something pacing me just beyond the edge of sight. The sun was low when I came across a partially frozen stream. Ice was fractured in strange patterns, too regular to be natural. I walked carefully across, testing every step. Something moved beneath the ice, or so I thought. The shadows in the surrounding woods seemed thicker, more deliberate. My chest tightened, breaths shallow, and for the first time, I truly understood the isolation. I was alone, yes, but something was watching, waiting, measuring, learning. As I set up camp later, the faintest exhalation echoed across the clearing, almost like imitation breath. I sat motionless for hours, waiting for a sign, any sign that I had been seen. The snow drifted quietly, footprints partially erased, but the pressure never lifted. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes open, listening to silence as if it were a roar, feeling that first real dread, the kind that gnaws at reason itself.
The next day, visibility dropped as clouds pressed low against the mountains, gray mist curling between tree trunks. The trail markers seemed wrong. The GPS continued to misalign, showing paths that didn't exist. Every step I took felt anticipated, mirrored in subtle ways. Snow-covered branches snapped behind me, and when I turned, there was never anything, but the sensation of presence persisted. I paused at a small ridge overlooking a frozen river, noting irregularities in the snow, prints too large to be human,
edges jagged in a way that suggested claws, but elongated unnaturally. They curved around my steps as if studying me, sometimes appearing behind me, sometimes ahead. I took a deep breath and pressed on, trying to keep focus on routine checks, wildlife signs, and trail markers. Deer tracks crisscrossed the snow, but none of the normal signs of human activity matched these massive prints. By mid-afternoon, I came across an abandoned shelter, roof caved, walls partially collapsed, but inside I noticed faint marks on a support beam, scratch marks, deep, deliberate, as if someone or something was measuring or testing the structure. I froze. The air felt heavier, colder than it should have been. A faint sound, almost a growl, echoed across the trees, quickly swallowed by the wind. I raised my rifle and waited, scanning, heart hammering. The snow drifted lightly, erasing minor details, but leaving the feeling of being observed intact. I decided to backtrack slightly, returning to higher ground where I could see further. That night, the fire in my small camp barely pushed back shadows that seemed to linger unnaturally, twisting just beyond perception. The exhalation returned, soft, deliberate, as though measuring my reactions. I could feel it pacing me, aligning with my heartbeat, waiting for a misstep. Sleep came in short bursts, but even then I was aware of the rhythm of the forest and of the creature hidden within.
By the third day, paranoia set in. I tracked footprints and broken branches, keeping careful notes in my log, but the pattern always shifted overnight. Snow that had fallen new seemed to erase my markings, or the path itself altered slightly. I began to notice subtle hints that the creature wasn't just observing, it was intelligent, patient, stalking without revealing itself. Branches snapped at impossible angles, and shadows moved with awareness of my location. My food cache was disturbed. A pack of protein bars had been opened and repositioned neatly, none eaten, just placed to signal attention. I moved cautiously, scanning constantly, rifle tight in my grip. Around dusk, I came across another clearing, this one marked by broken logs in a circle. The ground bore deep, irregular footprints that circled and then stopped abruptly. I noticed one of the prints was perfectly aligned with mine. My pulse spiked, adrenaline sharp. Something had mimicked me exactly. I whispered my own name softly, testing. A faint echo came back, delayed slightly, a distorted imitation. The wind shifted to carry it across the clearing. I froze. The sensation of being measured was undeniable. Hours passed in stillness. Every snap, every shift of snow made my muscles tense. I huddled near the small fire, rifle ready, watching the dark tree line. The forest pressed against me, patient, intelligent, and utterly alien. I understood then that I wasn't just alone. I was being studied, and every choice I made mattered. Morning arrived with gray light filtering through clouds. The trail continued deeper into the woods, twisting around frozen creek beds and snow-laden pines. I noticed more tracks, some mimicking my stride perfectly, others leading off into the forest and vanishing. The air was unnaturally still. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but the crunch of snow under my boots and the faint, deliberate exhalation that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I pressed on, eyes constantly scanning, heart pounding in time with subtle movements and shadows. Midday brought a sudden shift, a rapid exhalation of wind like breath and a movement in the tree line. I froze, rifle raised. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw it, tall, thin, shadowed, almost human but elongated, disappearing behind trees before I could focus. My pulse raced. I followed cautiously, keeping sight lines open, but it never revealed itself fully. The forest seemed to bend subtly, branches guiding me, snowdrifts shifting in impossible ways. I realized then that my surroundings weren't static. The woods themselves were adapting, responding to me, and I felt an almost oppressive sense of being evaluated. By late afternoon, I reached a small cabin marked for emergency use. Snow drifted over the trail leading in, almost erasing footprints. Inside, I found faint marks on the floor, elongated clawed impressions, arranged deliberately, stopping at the edge of the doorway. I shivered. The creature was close, intelligent, and patient. I understood fully that the wilderness I had entered was no ordinary place. It had a rhythm, and I was learning it under observation, every step, every thought, cataloged for reasons I could not yet comprehend.
The next morning, the forest felt heavier, more deliberate. Snow fell lightly, muffling sound, but leaving every impression sharp and visible. I followed the trail cautiously, rifle ready, noticing that some of my own footprints seemed to have been duplicated, elongated, and sometimes trailing me at an impossible distance. The sun was pale, diffused behind thick clouds, and visibility was limited, giving shadows an unnatural presence. I paused near a cluster of conifers when I heard it. A low exhalation, deliberate, slow, almost mimicking my own breathing. I froze, scanning every tree, every rock, but saw nothing. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. As I moved forward, I noticed more footprints, these ones curving around mine before vanishing into the woods. I kept my pace steady, trying not to give the forest an excuse to interact, but I felt eyes on me constantly. By midday, I came across a frozen creek, ice fractured in strange, unnatural patterns, deep lines etched into the surface that no human or animal could have made. As I crossed carefully, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a tall, shadowed figure standing still among the trees, distant, yet impossibly precise in posture. When I blinked, it was gone. Every instinct screamed danger, but curiosity and duty kept me moving. I reached a small rise overlooking a valley where the snow lay smooth and white. The trail ahead disappeared into dense forest, and every tree seemed to lean slightly, subtly guiding me. That night, I set up a small fire in a clearing, scanning constantly. The exhalations returned, slower now, deliberate, like a heartbeat echoing through the trees. I slept fitfully, half awake, dreaming of elongated shadows and footprints that led nowhere but always returned. By the fourth day, the pressure in the forest was suffocating. Every snap of a branch, every shifting shadow made me tense. I found more prints alongside my own, some imitating my stride exactly, others stretching unnaturally, clawed at the toes. At one point, I stumbled across a set of deeper impressions arranged around a fallen tree as if someone or something had circled deliberately. My pulse spiked, and I felt the instinct to flee, but I forced myself to observe, noting patterns and alignment. The forest seemed to move subtly around me, branches bending, snow shifting, almost like it was herding me along a path I didn't consciously choose. Around midday, I spotted movement, tall, thin, partially obscured by mist, standing upright far in the distance. I froze. The figure didn't run. It simply watched, waiting, perfectly still, until it dissolved into shadows. My hands shook slightly as I raised the rifle, scanning slowly. I pressed onward, adrenaline sharp, senses fully alert. Later, I discovered a small abandoned campsite, fire pit cold, logs stacked neatly, and clawed impressions pressed into the snow around it. I realized the creature wasn't just watching, it was studying, interacting with its environment in a deliberate way, marking territory, testing my perception.
Every step I took after that felt weighed, measured, observed. The sun was low, and I reached a natural ridge to survey the valley. The shadows of the trees stretched impossibly long, and I could feel the forest itself adjusting around me, subtle and intelligent, its presence pressing into my mind, unrelenting.
Night fell quickly, faster than expected, with clouds obscuring moonlight and stars. I huddled near my small fire, listening intently. Branches snapped at the edges of the clearing, soft at first, then louder, deliberate, mimicking the rhythm of my heartbeat. My eyes darted, scanning, yet I saw nothing. The shadows stretched unnaturally, bending in impossible ways, and I felt an exhalation of cold air sweep past me, like the forest itself was breathing around me. Sleep was impossible. At one point, I heard the faintest whisper of my own name, delayed, altered, just barely recognizable. My stomach twisted. I gripped my rifle tightly, straining to see, feeling the forest pressing in, calculating my reactions. Hours passed with me awake, rigid, every nerve alert. Occasionally the snow shifted in patterns that seemed deliberate, erasing footprints or creating new impressions that had not been there moments before. The sense of being studied, measured, manipulated was overwhelming. When dawn came, it brought a gray, heavy light, and the shadows retreated only slightly. I packed quickly, keeping my pace deliberate, every movement cautious. Tracks alongside mine persisted, sometimes ahead, sometimes trailing. I began to understand the intelligence behind them, the patience. Whatever watched me was not merely animal. It was deliberate, calculating, and far older than I could comprehend.
By mid-morning, the trail led me into denser forest, where snow-laden trees nearly blocked visibility. The footprints became more erratic, yet precise, following me exactly, disappearing into the woods and reappearing ahead. A snap of a branch echoed sharply, and I turned to see nothing, yet the feeling of eyes upon me was undeniable. I moved quickly now, adrenaline sharp, scanning constantly, rifle ready. Crossing a frozen creek, I noticed ice fractured in unnatural geometric patterns, deep lines like claws etched across its surface. I paused, every nerve on edge. Then I saw it, briefly. Tall, thin, shadowed, hunched slightly, but humanoid, standing behind a tree 50 meters away. Before I could raise the rifle, it vanished, leaving only the sensation of presence. I pressed on, heart pounding, every instinct screaming. Later, I reached another small clearing, snow drifting over the trail, erasing minor footprints. Here, the forest's presence pressed on me fully. I felt catalogued, measured, every movement observed. I realized then that I was no longer just exploring. I was part of its system. Every step, every breath, every glance mattered. And it was patient. I set up camp cautiously, keeping the fire small, scanning the tree line constantly, knowing that sleep would be short and fraught with unease.
Snow fell heavier as I moved deeper into the forest, covering the trail in soft, muffling layers that made each step uncertain. The footprints alongside mine persisted, sometimes ahead, sometimes mirroring me exactly, as though the forest itself had a pulse synchronized with my own. My senses were sharpened, every snap of a twig or shift of snow triggering my instincts. Midday brought a sudden gust of wind, carrying a faint exhalation that made the hairs on my neck rise. I froze. Shadows in the trees seemed thicker, almost purposeful, bending slightly as if to obscure or reveal. I pushed forward, eyes scanning constantly, heart hammering. Crossing a shallow creek, I noticed ice fractured in angular patterns, deep impressions that didn't match any natural phenomenon. Something had passed here, carefully, deliberately, and it had waited for me. I pressed on to a narrow valley where snow had drifted higher, forcing me to slow my pace. Every step felt anticipated. Then I saw it again, tall, thin, shadowed just at the edge of visibility. Its posture was unnaturally still, yet I felt its attention focused entirely on me. I raised my rifle, but it didn't flee, didn't advance, simply observed. I swallowed hard and moved cautiously, realizing the creature was not mindless. It studied, it waited, it understood me. That night I huddled in a small clearing, fire low, scanning constantly. Branches snapped in ways that seemed to mimic my own movements, and the forest itself seemed to pulse with awareness. Sleep was fractured, a haze of shadows and exhalations, footprints that appeared and vanished, impressions of something both humanoid and impossibly alien. By dawn, I understood fully that the wilderness here was alive in ways I had never encountered, and that my presence had been noted, measured, and catalogued with patient precision. By the 5th day, fear had begun to gnaw at my resolve. The forest had grown unpredictable, trail markers shifted subtly, snowdrifts altered overnight, and tracks alongside mine were more frequent, more deliberate. I began leaving markers of my own, sticks and scraps of cloth, only to find them displaced or doubled in the morning. At one point, I thought I glimpsed movement in the tree line, a tall, thin figure hunched slightly, indistinct in shadow, vanishing before I could focus. My pulse quickened. Later, I found a small hollow beneath an old spruce, littered with broken branches and claw-like markings. It was as if something had been waiting, testing, measuring. I pressed on, knowing I needed to maintain routine, but my every step felt anticipated, watched. Crossing a narrow ravine, snow cracking underfoot, I felt it, a presence heavier than air, pressing subtly against perception. The forest exhaled. I froze, listening to the faintest echoes of breath mingling with wind. For a heartbeat, I considered retreating, turning back the way I had come, but instinct and duty urged forward. I pressed onward, every sense alert, knowing that what followed me was patient, intelligent, and deliberate. As night fell, I set up a minimal fire in a small clearing. Shadows bent unnaturally around it, and a low exhalation drifted across the snow. Sleep was impossible. Every instinct screamed awareness. The forest itself had become a teacher, an evaluator, a sentient presence, and I was its student, caught in lessons that had no manual. Morning brought gray light, and I moved carefully along the trail. Footprints alongside mine became erratic, yet precise, leading me through denser trees where visibility was limited and snow drifted high. I noticed ice patterns again, clawed and angular, crossing creeks and small frozen ponds. Every step felt mirrored, measured, anticipated. At one point I glimpsed movement far in the distance, a tall, shadowed figure standing between trees, observing, unmoving. When I raised my rifle, it was gone, leaving only the impression of presence. Anxiety sharpened my focus. Crossing a shallow valley, I found a fallen log partially covered in snow. Beneath it, the snow had been disturbed in patterns too deliberate for any animal. Circular, precise, clawed. I realized that the creature's intelligence went beyond simple hunting. It interacted, it tested, it shaped the environment. By afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a frozen river. Tracks alongside mine had disappeared, leaving a faint exhalation in the air, almost like a warning. Shadows shifted unnaturally among the trees. That night, I set up camp in a clearing near the ridge. The exhalations returned intermittently, low and deliberate. Branches snapped in ways that mirrored my movements, as though the forest itself were alive with awareness. Sleep was fleeting, filled with dreams of elongated shadows, footprints that led nowhere, and a rhythm of attention I could not escape.
The sixth day began gray and heavy, snow falling steadily. I moved slowly, every footstep deliberate. The forest seemed to guide me subtly, branches nudging me along trails I did not consciously choose. Footprints continued to appear alongside mine, elongated and irregular, clawed at the toes, arranged deliberately. Crossing a narrow creek, I felt it, a presence pressing subtly, watching, learning. Ahead, in a slight clearing, I glimpsed it again, tall, thin, humanoid yet elongated, standing perfectly still. I froze. It did not flee or advance, only observed. I raised my rifle, scanning cautiously, but my pulse had become second nature to the forest's rhythm. Hours later, I reached an old survey cabin, partially collapsed, walls leaning, roof broken, snow covering most of it. Inside, marks were visible, clawed impressions on beams, circular scratches on the floor. The creature had been here, deliberately testing the environment, interacting without aggression. I realized fully then that my presence mattered. The forest and the creature within were observing, measuring, cataloging my every action. By nightfall, I huddled near a small fire, scanning constantly, aware of every subtle exhalation, every movement in the shadows. The wilderness had become sentient, intelligent, and patient, and I understood that I was no longer merely a visitor. I was part of its lessons, measured and watched in ways I could barely comprehend. The forest felt tighter the next morning, as if the space between the trees had subtly narrowed overnight. Snow fell steadily, muting sound and swallowing distance, and I found myself relying more on instinct than sight. My footprints were no longer alone. Elongated impressions appeared beside them almost immediately, perfectly paced, matching my stride in a way that made my stomach tighten. I stopped suddenly, testing the silence. The forest stopped with me. No wind, no settling branches, no distant animal calls. Only the faint pressure of awareness, heavy and deliberate. I moved again, slower this time, scanning the tree line. Shadows lingered unnaturally, stretching vertically between trunks. I crossed a frozen stream where the ice was etched with deep, angular lines, like something had dragged claws slowly, deliberately, savoring the sound. My breath fogged the air, and for a moment I thought I saw another plume of breath beside mine, taller, higher, dissipating just a fraction of a second later. Panic flared hot and sharp, but I forced myself to keep moving. Running would teach it something I didn't want it to learn. By midday, I reached a narrow corridor of trees where the snow had drifted high enough to slow my pace. That was when I heard movement ahead of me. Heavy, unhurried footsteps, compressing snow far deeper than my own. I froze. The sound stopped. Then it began again, circling, slow and patient, never fully revealing itself. I raised my rifle, heart pounding, rotating slowly, but saw only trees and shadow. The steps faded, replaced by that familiar low exhalation, closer now, intimate. I backed away carefully, every step deliberate, until the pressure eased slightly. By nightfall, I was shaking with exhaustion, setting camp quickly, fire low. Sleep never came. I lay awake, listening to footsteps that never fully arrived, knowing with growing certainty that it wasn't hunting me yet, it was learning me.
Morning brought no relief. The sky hung low and colorless, and the forest felt expectant, like a held breath. I resumed my patrol with slow, careful movements, hyper-aware of every sound and absence of sound. The tracks beside mine were closer now, sometimes overlapping my own, sometimes appearing ahead of me as if anticipating where I would step next. I found a stretch of trail where my GPS completely failed, spinning uselessly, the screen flickering before going dark. I relied on landmarks, but even those felt wrong, subtly rearranged. Trees I could have sworn were farther apart now crowded the path, forcing me through tighter spaces. I heard a sharp crack to my left and spun, rifle raised, just in time to see a tall shape slip behind a tree, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its posture wrong in a way my brain resisted processing. I fired once, the shot echoing violently through the silence. Snow fell from branches in heavy sheets. The forest absorbed the sound and returned to stillness. I waited, breath ragged, finger tight on the trigger. Nothing came. But the pressure returned, heavier now, closer. I moved fast then, breaking my own rules, adrenaline overriding caution. I pushed through drifts, lungs burning, branches clawing at my pack and arms. The footsteps followed, no longer subtle, no longer distant, but never closing the gap, always matching my pace perfectly. I burst into a clearing, stopped dead. The tracks ended abruptly at the center, both mine and the elongated ones, as if something had stepped straight up and vanished. I stood there shaking, realizing it could move in ways I couldn't, that distance meant nothing to it. That night, the exhalations came closer than ever, circling my camp just beyond firelight. I never saw it, but I felt it watching, patient, certain.
I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The forest never fully relaxed, and neither did I. At first light, I packed up and altered my route, heading toward lower ground where the trees thinned and visibility improved. The pressure followed immediately. Tracks reappeared beside mine within minutes, deeper now, sharper, as if the creature no longer bothered to hide its weight. I crossed a frozen river where the ice groaned beneath me, and halfway across I heard a sound behind me that made my blood run cold. A distorted imitation of my own breathing, too slow, too deep. I turned just in time to see it standing on the bank, partially obscured by mist. Tall, skeletal, its limbs bent at wrong angles, its head tilted slightly, as if studying my reaction. I raised the rifle, hands shaking, and for the first time it stepped forward. The ice between us cracked sharply. I fired again, the sound deafening. The creature recoiled slightly, more in curiosity than pain, then stepped back, dissolving into trees and shadow with impossible smoothness. I ran then, truly ran, lungs burning, fear eclipsing training. Branches tore at me, snow swallowed my legs, but I didn't stop until my vision blurred. When I finally collapsed behind a rocky outcrop, gasping, the forest was silent again. No pursuit, no sound, only the certainty that it could have followed, could have ended me at any moment. It chose not to. That realization terrified me more than the chase.
By the time I reached the outskirts of my patrol zone, I was hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. The forest felt looser here, less dense, as if the pressure had eased slightly, though the sense of being watched never fully faded. The tracks still appeared occasionally, but farther away now, less precise, as though the creature were content to observe from a distance. I reached a ranger supply cabin by dusk and barricaded myself inside, checking every window, every crack. That night, the exhalations came only once, faint and distant, like a final reminder. In the morning, the tracks were gone. The snow was smooth and untouched, as if nothing had ever been there. I hiked out by midday, never stopping, never looking back. When I reached the extraction point and heard the sound of the approaching aircraft, I felt a release so intense it almost brought me to my knees. I didn't report everything. Some things don't fit into forms or incident logs. I requested reassignment immediately. I never returned to Alaska. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that distorted breath, still see elongated shadows at the edge of my vision, and I know with absolute certainty that the wilderness doesn't chase everyone. Sometimes it just watches, waits, and remembers.
I thought leaving Alaska would quiet things, but distance didn't dull the memories the way I expected. The flight south felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. The forests below shrank into dark smears against white, and yet I could still feel that pressure, faint but familiar, like a hand resting just behind my thoughts. Back at headquarters, my debrief was brief and clinical. Equipment malfunction, environmental stress, no evidence of wildlife aggression. I didn't argue. Some truths don't survive being spoken aloud. They reassigned me within the week, a coastal park far from deep woods, far from isolation. I told myself it was enough. At first, it almost was. The sound of waves replaced the endless hush of snow, and the trees stood wider apart, less oppressive. But sometimes, during early morning patrols, I'd catch myself slowing, listening too carefully, scanning shadows that didn't matter. I started noticing patterns again, subtle things that tugged at my awareness, footprints where they shouldn't be, a sense of being observed that came and went without reason. I knew it wasn't there, not physically, but the forest had rewired something inside me. I stopped hiking recreationally. I avoided dense woods altogether. Friends noticed, asked questions. I told them Alaska had changed me, which was true, though not in ways they could understand. Sleep became fragmented, filled with dreams of elongated shapes standing just beyond firelight, breathing in time with my own. Sometimes I woke convinced there was someone standing in my room, tall and silent, watching with patient curiosity. There never was. Still, I kept the lights on longer than I used to.
Years passed, but the memory never softened. If anything, it sharpened, polished by repetition, until every detail felt etched into me permanently. I read reports when similar incidents surfaced, missing hikers, distorted tracks, unexplained sounds deep in northern forests. I never commented, never shared my experience. I knew better. The creature, whatever it was, didn't need belief to exist. It operated outside that framework entirely. It wasn't a monster in the way stories describe. It wasn't rage or hunger or malice. It was patience, observation, adaptation. That was what unsettled me most. Sometimes when winter storms rolled in and the world went quiet, I felt that familiar pressure return, faint but undeniable. I'd find myself holding my breath, listening for another exhale that never quite came. I stopped carrying firearms off duty. I stopped thinking they mattered. If it wanted me, I knew distance and weapons wouldn't change the outcome. What stayed with me was the certainty that it chose not to follow, not because it couldn't, but because it didn't need to. I had already learned what it wanted me to learn, that the wilderness doesn't belong to us, that survival doesn't equal dominance, that sometimes being allowed to leave is the most deliberate decision of all. I began to understand that Alaska hadn't been an encounter so much as an introduction, a reminder that some places are not meant to be conquered or explained. They are meant to be endured briefly, respectfully, and then left behind.
On my last anniversary of leaving Alaska, I drove inland farther than usual, stopping at the edge of a managed forest where trails were wide and clearly marked. Families passed me, dogs running ahead, laughter cutting easily through the trees. It should have felt safe. It did, mostly. Still, I stood there longer than necessary, watching the tree line, feeling that old instinct stir. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a shape deeper in the woods, tall and thin, standing impossibly still between trunks. My heart stuttered. I blinked, focused. There was nothing there, just trees, just shadow. I turned back toward my car without stepping onto the trail. That night, I slept better than I had in years, dreamless and heavy. When I woke, the sense of pressure was gone entirely, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance, maybe, or resignation. I realized then that whatever had watched me in Alaska had never followed, because it didn't need to. It existed beyond my fear, beyond my understanding, part of a system older and far more patient than I could ever be. And I understood my role clearly for the first time. I wasn't prey, I wasn't chosen, I was simply observed, measured, and dismissed. The woods didn't want me, and that knowledge, strangely enough, was the closest thing to peace I'd felt since leaving.
I still work as a ranger. I still believe in protecting wild places, but I no longer mistake them for benign ones. Alaska taught me that survival doesn't always come from strength or experience, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what attacks you, but what chooses not to. I don't tell stories around campfires. I don't laugh at legends. When people ask why I never go north anymore, I tell them some places don't need me, and that I learned how to listen when I was younger. Late at night, when the world goes quiet and the wind moves just right, I sometimes pause, holding still, listening for a breath that doesn't belong to me. I never hear it, and I hope I never do again, because if I did, I know it wouldn't be a warning, it would be recognition.